The frozen ground crunched beneath his boots as Captain William Eldridge knelt in the mud somewhere in the Ardennes forest, December 1944. His men watched in bewilderment as their commanding officer scooped up a handful of dark earth, brought it close to his nose, then placed a small amount on his tongue. Sergeant Matthews shook his head. Private Kowalski whispered to the man beside him. They thought their captain had finally cracked under the pressure of this brutal winter campaign. They had no idea that this strange ritual, this seemingly insane behavior, would save hundreds of American lives and expose one of the most elaborate German defensive networks ever constructed on the Western Front. William Eldridge grew up on a farm in rural Oklahoma during the Great Depression, while other boys played baseball and went to picture shows. And young William spent his days working the family's struggling land alongside his father, a man who knew soil the way sailors know the sea. His father taught him something that most people would consider useless: how to identify different types of earth by taste and texture, how to read the land's history through its layers, how to know what lay beneath without ever digging. When William enlisted in 1942 and rose through the ranks to become a combat engineer officer, nobody imagined that a farm boy's peculiar skill would become a weapon of war. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest on record in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge had just begun, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and turn the tide of the war. The German Wehrmacht had launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense Ardennes forest, and catching American forces off guard. Entire divisions were scattered, surrounded, or pushed back in chaos. The 291st Combat Engineer Battalion, Captain Eldridge's unit, found themselves tasked with an impossible mission: advance through enemy-held territory, locate German defensive positions, and clear a path for American armor to break through and relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. But there was a problem that nobody had anticipated. The Germans had been preparing for months, maybe years. They had constructed an intricate network of underground bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and reinforced fighting positions that were virtually invisible from the surface. Snow covered everything. The forest was thick. American reconnaissance planes couldn't see through the canopy. And ground patrols were being cut down by machine gun fire from positions they never saw until it was too late. Men were dying because they couldn't see the enemy, couldn't predict where fire would come from next. Traditional methods of detecting fortifications had failed completely. On the morning of December 21st, after losing 12 men in 2 days to hidden German positions, Captain Eldridge called his platoon leaders together. He told them about the soil. He explained that military fortifications, especially bunkers built deep enough to withstand artillery, required specific types of earth excavation. The Germans would have dug down into older geological layers, and that disturbed earth had to go somewhere. Even under snow, even after weeks or months, the signs would remain. Different soil compositions, different minerals, different colors and textures that didn't belong together naturally. He could taste the difference. He could taste the lime from concrete mixing. He could taste the clay from deep excavations. He could taste the war hiding beneath their feet. His officers stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Major Hendricks from battalion headquarters, when he heard about the plan, threatened to have Eldridge removed from command and sent for psychiatric evaluation. But Colonel Davis, the battalion commander who had known Eldridge since North Africa, made a decision that would change everything. He gave the captain 24 hours to prove his theory. One day to show that eating dirt could win battles. Eldridge moved out before dawn on December 22nd with a hand-picked squad of 8 men. They thought they were babysitting a crazy officer on his final mission before a rubber room. They crossed into what intelligence believed was contested territory, though in the thick forest, every shadow could hide a German machine gun nest. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. Eldridge moved slowly, methodically, stopping every 100 yards to examine the ground. He would brush away snow, feel the earth, sometimes taste it. His men watched nervously, scanning the tree line for enemy movement, certain that their captain's strange behavior would get them all killed. 2 hours into their patrol, Eldridge stopped. He knelt down and began digging with his entrenching tool through 8 inches of snow. Beneath it, he found what he was looking for: earth that looked wrong. The soil was darker than it should be, mixed with clay that came from much deeper underground. He tasted it. Limestone, concrete dust. He tasted the enemy. He stood up and pointed to a spot 30 yards ahead where the forest seemed undisturbed, where nothing appeared unusual. He told his men there was a German bunker right there, probably with firing ports aimed directly at their current position. They looked at him. They looked at the forest. They saw nothing. Sergeant Matthews volunteered to scout forward. He crawled through the snow, moving tree to tree, his Thompson submachine gun ready. The squad waited, barely breathing. Matthews got within 20 feet of where Eldridge had pointed. Then he froze. He signaled back with frantic hand gestures. The captain was right. Hidden beneath camouflage netting and months of forest growth was a concrete observation bunker with firing slits covering the entire approach. Matthews could see the barrels of at least 2 machine guns inside. If they had continued on their planned route, walking upright through the forest, the entire squad would have been slaughtered. They marked the position on their maps and moved on. Over the next 6 hours, Captain Eldridge identified 7 more hidden positions, using nothing but his hands and his ability to read the earth. Bunkers that housed machine gun teams, mortar positions, ammunition storage, even the entrance to an underground command post. Each time, his men grew more amazed and more terrified. They were walking through a killing field that had been carefully prepared and perfectly hidden. Without Eldridge's bizarre talent, American forces would have walked into a slaughter. When they returned to friendly lines that evening, Captain Eldridge delivered his report to Colonel Davis. 8 confirmed enemy positions, all marked with precise coordinates. Davis contacted division artillery. That night, American guns opened up on targets they couldn't see, coordinates provided by a captain who tasted dirt. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. When it stopped, the forest burned. Hidden bunkers that had survived months of winter were reduced to rubble in less than an hour. The next morning, American infantry advanced through positions that would have cost hundreds of lives to take. They walked through the smoking remains of bunkers they never knew existed. Eldridge's patrol hadn't fired a single shot, but they had won a battle before it began. Word spread quickly through the division. The dirt-eating captain had proven himself, but Major Hendricks still wasn't convinced. He argued it could have been luck, coincidence that Eldridge had simply guessed well. He demanded a demonstration. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, in front of a group of skeptical officers, Captain Eldridge conducted a blind test. He was taken to 3 different locations, given no information about what intelligence suspected was there. At each site, he examined the soil. At the first location, he identified the remains of a hastily abandoned German supply depot. At the second, he found nothing and declared the area clear. At the third, he identified what he believed was a recently constructed fighting position, probably within the last 2 weeks. The engineers were sent to investigate all 3 sites. Eldridge was correct on all 3 counts. The skeptics went silent. The mockery stopped. The whispers about the crazy captain turned into requests for his assistance. For the next 3 weeks, Captain Eldridge became one of the most valuable assets in the Ardennes campaign. He was assigned a dedicated team of combat engineers and given priority access to any sector where American forces were meeting unexpected resistance. His method was simple but exhaustingly dangerous. He would move into contested areas, sometimes ahead of the main lines, and read the earth like a book written in mud and minerals. He identified bunker complexes at Rocherath, hidden artillery positions near Manhay, and an entire network of underground tunnels at Butgenbach that the Germans had been using to move troops undetected. By January 12, 1945, when the Battle of the Bulge officially ended with Allied victory, Captain William Eldridge had personally identified 31 separate German fortified positions. Intelligence estimates suggested that his discoveries had prevented somewhere between 400 and 600 American casualties. Entire platoons that would have walked into ambushes lived because a farm boy from Oklahoma could taste the difference between natural earth and ground disturbed by military construction. But the cost weighed heavy on Eldridge himself. Walking ahead of the lines, exposing himself repeatedly to locate enemy positions, took its toll. On January 8th, while surveying a sector near Houffalize, his luck finally ran out. A German sniper watching from a position Eldridge hadn't yet identified put a bullet through his left shoulder. The captain survived, but his war was over. He was evacuated to England for treatment, then sent home to the United States. He never returned to combat. The official after-action reports from the Ardennes campaign mentioned his contributions in dry military language. Several of his superior officers recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, but the paperwork was lost in the chaos of the war's final months. He received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. His men knew the truth. The soldiers who fought beside him, who watched him kneel in the snow and taste the earth while machine gun fire echoed through the forest. They knew that William Eldridge had saved their lives with a skill that nobody believed could matter. After the war, Eldridge returned to Oklahoma. He never spoke much about his service. He went back to farming, back to the land that had taught him everything he needed to know. When people asked him about the war, he would tell them about friends he lost, battles he survived, but he rarely mentioned the dirt. It seemed too strange, too unbelievable. Even his own children didn't learn the full story until decades later, when aging veterans from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion began gathering for reunions and sharing memories of the captain who could taste German bunkers. Modern military engineers still study the Ardennes campaign, still analyze how German fortifications were detected and destroyed. In the textbooks and official histories, you'll find technical discussions of reconnaissance techniques, aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar. You won't find much about Captain William Eldridge and his unorthodox methods. But in the oral histories, in the recorded interviews with veterans who were there, his name appears again and again. The men who served under him, who watched skeptically at first and then with growing awe, they made sure his story didn't disappear entirely. There's a lesson buried in the frozen earth of the Ardennes forest, in the story of a farm boy who became an unlikely hero. War demands conventional thinking, traditional methods, proven tactics. But sometimes survival comes from the most unexpected places, from skills that seem useless until the moment they become essential. Now, William Eldridge's ability to taste soil and identify fortifications saved hundreds of lives because one colonel was willing to take a chance on something that sounded impossible, because one captain was brave enough to risk looking foolish in order to keep his men alive. The bunkers he discovered are gone now, destroyed in 1945 or reclaimed by the forest in the decades since. The snow that covered those killing fields has melted and fallen and melted again through 80 winters. The men who mocked him and the men who believed in him have mostly passed on, their own wars finally over. But the story remains, preserved in military archives and veteran testimonies, a reminder that heroism takes many forms and that sometimes the strangest talents become the most valuable weapons. Captain William Eldridge died in 1989 at the age of 71, buried in a small cemetery in Oklahoma, the earth he understood so completely finally taking him home. His headstone lists his rank, his unit, his medals. It doesn't mention the dirt. It doesn't need to. The men he saved knew. They remembered. And now, so will you.